She had 30 seconds before they threw her out. The head nurse's fingers closed around the chain at Rachel Hayes' throat and yanked. Not a tug, not a warning, a yank. And the dog tags hit the linoleum floor of Pine Valley Medical Center with a sound like a gunshot. The metal skidded under a supply cart. A trauma nurse near the medication station turned. A resident at the central desk looked up from his chart. Nobody moved. "She stole those," the head nurse's voice cut across the ER. "From a dead Marine." Rachel didn't reach for the floor. She stood with her hands at her sides and her jaw set, and she looked at the head nurse the way you look at something you've seen before and hoped you wouldn't have to see again. "I didn't steal them," she said. "They were given to me." Nobody believed her. Within 4 minutes, hospital security had 2 officers flanking Rachel Hayes and the director of Pine Valley Medical Center, Dr. Garrison Lyle, who had built his reputation on efficiency and press releases, was already walking down the hall with the satisfied expression of a man who had been waiting for an excuse. Then, from the parking lot windows visible at the end of the corridor, the first Marine Corps vehicle pulled in. Then another, then a third. Before you hear what happened next, if this story is already making your heart beat a little faster, follow along to the end. Like this video. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from, because I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. Marlow, Oregon was the kind of city that had almost become something. The tech companies had looked at it in the early 2000s and moved on. The hospital had been built during an optimistic decade and had spent every year since then trying to justify its existence through expansion projects and departmental restructuring and a rotating door of administrators who arrived with visions and left with settlements. Rachel Hayes had grown up 40 minutes north of Marlow, in a town so small the high school shared a building with the middle school. She had been the kind of kid who stayed calm during emergencies, the one who called 911 when her neighbor collapsed, the one who kept pressure on a wound at a car accident when everyone else was on their phones. She hadn't become a nurse because it was the obvious choice. She'd become a nurse because it was what she was already doing. She was 29 now and had worked the emergency department at Pine Valley for 14 months. She was good at the job in the way some people are good at things without making it obvious. The patients liked her. The overnight residents called for her when a line was difficult. She could read a room of incoming trauma the way some people read weather. She didn't talk about her past. She brought the same lunch every shift. She drove a truck with a cracked windshield she'd been meaning to replace for 8 months. She was by every visible measure unremarkable. The dog tags had been around her neck every shift since she'd started. Simple chain, 2 rectangular pieces of metal. She wore them under her scrubs. She'd never explained them to anyone because no one had asked, and she was not the kind of person who explained herself without being asked. The head nurse's name was Sandra Breck. She had been at Pine Valley for 11 years and ran the nursing staff with the organizational precision of someone who had long ago decided that efficiency was the same thing as leadership. She had noticed Rachel on Rachel's 3rd shift, had formed an opinion by the end of the first week, and had spent the following 14 months proving she was right. Rachel was too quiet, didn't socialize with the team, didn't explain her decisions in a way that invited collaboration, had twice, overridden a physician's order because she'd seen something the physician had missed and had been right both times, which was somehow worse than being wrong. The dog tags became Sandra's entry point on a Tuesday morning during a shift change when Rachel was updating chart notes and Sandra walked past, glanced at the chain visible above Rachel's collar, and stopped. "Are those military?" Rachel looked up. "Yes." "Whose?" A pause, just long enough to be noticeable. "A friend's." Sandra's expression shifted in a way that was very small and very deliberate. "A friend who's still alive?" Rachel held her gaze for a moment. "No." That was the whole conversation. Sandra walked away. But something had been decided. The accusation came 4 days later, and it came publicly, which was not an accident. Rachel was 3 hours into a busy shift. A pediatric fever, a construction worker with a hand injury, a 62-year-old coming in with chest tightness that turned out to be nothing but cost him and his family a miserable afternoon. When Sandra Breck walked into the center of the ER with the specific kind of deliberateness that means something is about to happen in front of witnesses, Hayes? Rachel was at the nursing station. She finished the notation she was writing and looked up. Those tags. Sandra gestured at her own throat. Where did you get them? We talked about this. We're talking about it again, in front of people who can hear. Rachel set down the pen. They were given to me by the Marine who wore them. He gave them to me before a mission. He didn't come back. That's a very convenient story. It's not a story. Sandra's voice rose slightly, just enough for the shift to notice, for conversations to pause, for two residents to look up from the workstation. Because a family came forward, a military family, and they believe those tags were taken from a Marine who died. They believe someone without the right, has been wearing them and acting like she has some connection to the military she never actually had. The room was quiet now. Not the normal ER quiet, which is never truly quiet, but the particular quiet of people who have stopped their work to watch something. Rachel's face did not change. I served. I earned every connection I have. We'd like to see proof of that. You don't have the authority to ask me for proof of anything. Sandra stepped closer. The director has been notified. You can explain yourself to him. What happened next happened quickly. Dr. Garrison Lyle appeared from his office hallway with an administrator named Paul Gersh at his shoulder, which meant this had been arranged, which meant Lyle had been briefed and had made a decision before hearing a single word from Rachel. Two security officers materialized. Sandra reached for the chain. Rachel could have stepped back. She chose not to, which was its own kind of statement. The yank, the floor, the sound of metal on linoleum. Those tags were given to me, Rachel said. Lyle looked at her with the tired impatience of a man who has made a decision and wants it finished. We're going to need you to step away from patient care until this is resolved. I'm in the middle of a shift. Your shift is done. He nodded to the security officers. Please escort Ms. Hayes to the exit. She didn't argue further. That was the thing about Rachel Hayes that people consistently misread. Her silence looked like submission. It wasn't. It was economy. It was the particular quiet of someone who has learned that some situations do not reward words. She retrieved the dog tags from the floor, clasped them in her fist, and walked toward the exit. The ER waiting room was a particular kind of controlled chaos on the afternoon they suspended Rachel Hayes. 23 people in chairs, the television in the corner cycling through cable news, a kid with a wrapped ankle, an elderly couple filling out forms together with the careful coordination of people who had been doing difficult things together for decades. Rachel made it through the waiting room and through the first set of automatic doors before she stopped. Her truck was in the far lot. She had her keys. She had her bag over one shoulder. She stood in the receiving area between the inner and outer doors, that glass limbo where the air smells like disinfectant and every exhale fogs slightly in winter, and she stood there for a full 30 seconds doing nothing. Then she unclenched her fist and looked at the dog tags, the name stamped into the metal, Corporal James Aldrin, blood type O positive, no other information that the metal needed to give. She had known James Aldrin for 4 years in service and had worked alongside him through 2 deployments and had watched him walk into a mission with the specific calm of someone who has made peace with probability. And he had pressed these tags into her palm the night before that final mission and said, "Keep them moving. They need to know someone's counting." She had asked him what that meant. He'd said he'd explain when he got back. She stood in the glass corridor and held the metal and breathed. Then, from the parking lot, the first vehicle appeared. Not a car, not an SUV, a military vehicle, the specific utilitarian shape of a Marine Corps transport, dull green, no markings that meant anything to civilians. Then a second, then a third, and a black sedan with government plates, and a fourth transport, and the slow, deliberate procession of a convoy that had been called somewhere specific and intended to arrive. Rachel watched them pull into the hospital lot. She had no way of knowing yet what they were doing there. She had some guesses and did not look at them directly. She pushed through the outer door and stood on the sidewalk in the gray Marlow afternoon and waited. Inside the ER, the timing was catastrophic. At 2:41 p.m., a 40-passenger interstate bus on Route 84 westbound had lost its front axle on the elevated stretch of highway 4 miles from downtown Marlow. The driver had managed to keep it mostly upright for 300 feet before it went through a guardrail and came to rest on an access road embankment. There were no fatalities at the scene. There were 19 critical injuries, 14 moderate, and 7 who walked away. Among the passengers, a group of active-duty Marines traveling in civilian clothes to a regional training facility. The first ambulances hit the Pine Valley ER at 2:58 p.m. Rachel heard the sirens from the sidewalk. 2 units, then a third, then a fourth. She saw the lights before she could see the vehicles. She knew the sound of a mass casualty arrival the way she knew the sound of her own name. She turned back toward the entrance. She made it through the outer doors before Paul Gersh appeared. Administrator, not security, which meant someone had seen her on the camera and dispatched the person they thought would be most effective. Ms. Hayes. He positioned himself in the corridor with his ID badge and his lanyard and the specific bodily posture of someone performing authority. You've been suspended pending investigation. You can't be here. There's a mass casualty event. Hospital staff will handle it. She looked past him into the waiting room where she could already see the first gurney coming through the ambulance bay doors. A patient with cervical collar and oxygen mask. A paramedic calling vitals to a nurse who was writing on a glove instead of a chart, because there was no time for a chart. Who's running trauma? Rachel asked. Gersh didn't answer, which was its own answer. Dr. Vance is on, he finally said. We have sufficient staff. Vance was a capable physician. Vance had never managed a 23-patient mass casualty with a trauma bay built for 8. Rachel had. She had managed it in an inflatable field hospital with 2 nurses and a corpsman under artillery fire at a distance of 400 meters, and she had lost nobody. She said none of this. She looked at Gersh and then past him, and then she said very quietly, if someone dies in there because you're short-handed, that's on you. Step outside, Ms. Hayes. She stepped outside. The Marine convoy had parked in the hospital's main lot. The vehicles were arranged with the deliberate geometry of military habit, not haphazard, not civilian. Rachel could see figures in uniform at the far end of the lot, a colonel's insignia, a 2-vehicle escort for the black sedan. She stood on the sidewalk and watched the ER entrance where gurneys kept coming. She counted. 7th gurney, 8th. She could see through the glass that the waiting room had been converted to overflow. She could see a nurse she recognized, Tomas Rea, good nurse, solid under pressure, moving between 3 patients simultaneously with the specific slightly too fast movement of someone who needs 4 more hands. She pulled out her phone. She didn't call anyone. She looked at it for a long moment and then put it back in her pocket. The colonel's group had separated. The colonel herself, a woman, 50s, the particular posture of someone who had spent decades being the most prepared person in any room, was moving toward the hospital entrance with 2 officers flanking her and a civilian in a dark suit behind. They walked past Rachel without recognizing her because there was no reason to recognize her. She was just a woman in scrubs standing on a sidewalk. Then one of the flanking officers, young, Lieutenant's bars, face that still had the particular expression of someone learning to contain surprise in front of senior officers, looked at her. Looked at her hands. At the dog tags she was still holding, not wearing, just holding. His expression changed. He said something quietly to the colonel, who stopped. The colonel turned and looked at Rachel with the assessing attention of someone who processes information in categories that most civilians don't have. Name, the colonel said. Rachel kept her voice level. Hayes. Rachel Hayes. A pause. 12 seconds that felt much longer. The colonel looked at the dog tags in Rachel's hand. She didn't ask about them. Are you the nurse they removed from the emergency department? Rachel blinked. You heard about that. We heard about it before we pulled into the lot. The colonel glanced at the hospital entrance. I have men in there. From the highway accident. I know. I've been counting the gurneys. The colonel studied her for another moment. The civilian in the suit had moved to the colonel's shoulder and was looking at Rachel with an expression of careful professional interest. Colonel Diane Marsh, the colonel said. She did not offer her hand. You said your name was Hayes. Yes, ma'am. Former Navy? Rachel met her eyes. Yes, ma'am. Colonel Marsh turned to the civilian. Get me a line to the director of this hospital. She said it with the matter-of-fact authority of someone who does not make requests, who makes statements about what is about to happen. Then she looked back at Rachel. "Don't go anywhere," she said. Inside, the emergency department was failing. Not catastrophically, not yet, but in the incremental way that mass casualty situations unravel when leadership is stretched. Small decisions made badly, competing priorities not sorted, resources not triaged correctly. Dr. Vance was doing his best, which was considerable, but his best was designed for a department handling 7 critical patients simultaneously, not 19. He was moving between bays with the expression of a man running calculations he doesn't have enough variables for. Sandra Breck was coordinating intake, which she was competent at. But 2 of the critical patients had spinal injuries that needed positioning she hadn't seen often, and she was on her radio to Vance every 90 seconds, and Vance was already on the radio with the surgical team about an internal bleeder in Bay 3. In Bay 6, a Marine, 23 years old, PFC, according to the civilian ID in his wallet, traveling in jeans and a gray t-shirt, was losing ground. Blunt abdominal trauma. His pressure was dropping. The nurse assigned to his bay was competent, but not reading the rate of decline correctly, and no one had flagged it to Vance yet because Vance had 4 other flags ahead of it. Rachel could not see any of this. She was on the sidewalk. She stood with her arms crossed and the dog tags in her left fist, and she watched the glass doors and counted the time between gurney arrivals and did the math in her head with the automaticity of someone who has done this math many times in conditions far worse than this. Her phone buzzed. A text from Tomas Rea. "You still outside? We need you." She looked at the text. She looked at the doors. She thought about Gersh and Lyle and the calculation of what it would cost her to walk back in without clearance. She was still doing that math when the colonel's aide appeared at the entrance and looked at her and said, "The colonel wants you inside." Rachel uncrossed her arms. She put the dog tags around her neck. She walked toward the doors. Through the glass, she could already see which bay had the critical problem, because she knew what the wrong kind of stillness looks like from 50 feet away through a window, and Bay 6 had it. The automatic doors opened. The noise of the ER hit her. Monitors, voices, the specific compressed urgency of too many emergencies competing for the same attention. She moved past the waiting area and past the intake desk and past the administrator who started to say her name and stopped when she didn't stop walking. Bay 6 was on her left. The nurse there looked up when Rachel came in, relief crossing her face so fast it was almost painful to see. And Rachel was already at the bedside reading the monitor, reading the patient, reading the IV lines, processing. "When did his pressure start dropping?" she asked. "Maybe 8 minutes ago. I thought it was stabilizing." "It's not stabilizing." Rachel looked at the patient. Young face, jaw clenched with the effort of staying conscious, eyes tracking her. She spoke directly to him. "I'm Rachel. I'm a nurse." "You with me?" "Yeah," he said. It came out thin. "What's your name?" "Donnie." "Donnie, I need you to stay with me. I know it hurts. Stay with me." She turned to the nurse. "Get Vance. Tell him Bay 6 is escalating. Suspected internal bleed, and I need a trauma surgeon down here in the next 3 minutes. Don't ask. Tell." The nurse went. Rachel worked with both hands, 2 tasks simultaneously, the way she had learned in conditions that did not allow for sequential thinking. She was aware, at the edge of her attention, of movement in the hallway. The colonel, the civilian in the suit, and behind them, Dr. Garrison Lyle, with an expression she didn't have time to look at. Someone in the hallway said her name, and she didn't turn. Someone else said something she didn't catch, and she didn't turn. Donnie's eyes were losing focus. "Donnie," she said sharp, "stay with me." His eyes came back. "Good," she said. "Good. Stay right here." In the hallway behind her, she could hear Lyle's voice, elevated but controlled. She was suspended. She doesn't have authorization to be. And she heard the colonel's voice, which was neither elevated nor lowered, which had the flat particular quality of someone who has learned that the most effective authority doesn't need volume. "Dr. Lyle, the nurse in that bay is the most qualified trauma nurse in this hospital by a margin you are not currently equipped to understand. I suggest you let her work." Rachel didn't look up. She had a patient with a dropping pressure and a narrowing window, and she had 3 minutes before Vance arrived, and she was going to use every second of them. At 3:34 p.m., the trauma surgeon reached Base 6. At 3:36 p.m., she made the call to move Donnie Ferris, PFC, to the surgical suite. At 3:37 p.m., Rachel stepped back from the bay and stripped off her gloves and allowed herself, briefly, to feel the slight tremor in her hands that she had been managing for the past 22 minutes. She turned to the hallway. Lyle was there. Sandra Breck was there. Gersh was there. The colonel was there. And her aide, and the civilian who Rachel now understood from context, was JAG, Judge Advocate General, Military Legal, which meant someone had anticipated needing legal representation before this convoy arrived. Lyle's face had done something complicated. He had the look of a man whose plan has developed a structural problem he can't account for. Rachel looked at him without any particular expression. "I'd like to speak with your director," Colonel Marsh said from Lyle's left. "Privately. And I'd like someone to find me a chair and a table, because what I'm about to show him is going to take a few minutes to look at properly." Lyle looked at her. "Colonel, I appreciate your concern for your men, but the situation with this nurse, Dr. Lyle." The colonel stopped him with 2 words and a half-second of silence. "I know exactly what the situation is with this nurse. I am here, in part, because of this nurse. And the documents I'm carrying are going to make the situation with you considerably more interesting." Lyle looked at the JAG officer. The JAG officer had the expression of someone who has heard this sentence before and knows what comes next. Sandra Breck took a small, involuntary step backward. From the end of the hallway, Tomas Rea was watching all of it with his arms crossed and his face carefully neutral, except around his eyes, where he was not neutral at all. Rachel said nothing. She looked at the dog tags in her fist and then slowly put them back around her neck. The chain settled against her collarbone, where it had lived for 14 months, where it had lived, in truth, for longer than that. "There's a conference room on the 2nd floor," Rachel said. She said it to Lyle, not to the colonel, which was its own statement about where the power in this hallway actually lived. "I'd start there." Lyle looked at her. He looked at the colonel. He looked at the doors of his own emergency department, where his staff was managing 19 patients, and where the nurse he'd suspended 40 minutes ago had just kept one of them alive. Something moved through his expression that was not quite recognition and not quite fear, but occupied the space between them. He straightened his jacket. "Conference room is down the left corridor," he said. His voice had changed. "Not much. Enough." The colonel nodded once and turned and walked in that direction, and the aide followed, and the JAG officer followed, and Gersh fell into step behind them with the slightly dazed walk of someone watching a situation exceed its expected parameters. Lyle stood in place for a moment. Then he followed. Sandra Breck was last. She stopped beside Rachel, and for a moment they were side by side, which was not a position either of them had intended. And Sandra said, very quietly, "She's military brass. She's just defending her own." Rachel looked at the closed doors of Base 6, where a 23-year-old named Donnie was in surgery because someone had caught it in time. "Yeah," she said. "That's what it looks like when someone does that." She walked back toward the trauma bays, where 9 more patients still needed her. From the 2nd floor conference room, the JAG officer opened a case file. The documents inside were organized with the careful precision of something that had been put together in anticipation of exactly this kind of moment. The kind of anticipation that means someone had seen this coming before it happened. Among the documents, a service record running 7.5 years, naval service, combat nursing attachments to Marine Corps units in 2 theaters, commendations, a promotion to lieutenant, fitness reports that used words like exceptional under duress and demonstrates tactical medical leadership beyond great expectations, and in one report filed after a 6-month deployment, the most effective trauma nurse this command has deployed in 14 years of active service. At the back of the file, behind the service record, and the commendations and the fitness reports, was a single document from a Marine Corps chaplain, dated 26 months ago. It documented the circumstances under which one CPL James Aldrin, before his final mission, had entrusted his identification tags to Lieutenant Rachel Hayes, with the specific intent that she carry them that she keep them moving as a practice common in certain close unit contexts, a way of ensuring that a fallen Marine's identity would always be in the hands of someone who would bring him home. He did not come home. She had brought his name home instead. Lyle read the chaplain's document 3 times. His expression, when he looked up from it, was the expression of a man who has just understood the shape of a very bad decision he made 40 minutes ago. Colonel Marsh watched him from across the table. "The tags were not stolen," she said. She didn't say it with satisfaction. She said it the way you state a coordinate. They were entrusted, formally, with witnesses. Lyle set the document down. The conference room was very quiet. Outside the window in the parking lot, the Marine Corps vehicles sat in their deliberate geometry, and the afternoon light was going gray, and somewhere in the building below them, a nurse who had saved lives in 2 countries was saving one more. Lyle opened his mouth. Then he closed it. Then Paul Gersh, from the chair beside him, said, quietly, with the specific tone of someone identifying a problem and already calculating an exit, "Garrison, we need to talk about the other thing." Lyle looked at him. Gersh looked at the table. The JAG officer looked at both of them with the focused attention of someone whose job is to remember exactly what happens next. "The other thing," Colonel Marsh said, "is already in a separate file." She set a second folder on the table. Lyle looked at it. He did not touch it. Outside, another ambulance pulled into the bay, lights going, a medic already calling vitals before the doors were fully open, and somewhere in the building below, the sound of the emergency department doing what emergency departments do, barely holding the line between disaster and survival, one decision at a time, one pair of hands at a time. Rachel's hands were at the center of it, and in the conference room on the second floor, the second folder sat unopened on the table, and Lyle's face had gone the specific gray of a man who knows what's inside it and knows there is no longer any version of this day in which he walks out of this building with what he walked in with. The JAG officer uncapped his pen. "Dr. Lyle," he said, "let's start from the beginning." The JAG officer's pen didn't move yet. He was waiting, and the waiting was deliberate. The kind of deliberate that Lyle would understand later as the moment he should have called a lawyer, should have said nothing, should have treated the folder on the table like the loaded thing it was. Instead, Lyle looked at Paul Gersh, and Gersh looked at his own hands, and in that exchange, 2 seconds, maybe 3, both of them communicated everything the JAG officer needed to know about their respective calculations. "There's nothing in that folder that concerns this hospital," Lyle said. Colonel Marsh didn't open it. "That's an interesting position to take before you know what's in it." "I know what's in it." "Then you know this conversation is going to run long." She settled back in her chair with the patience of someone who has conducted interviews in conditions considerably less comfortable than a hospital conference room. "So let's not waste time on posture, Dr. Lyle. You suspended a nurse this afternoon on a theft accusation that you were told—" She paused, and the pause was surgical. "Before you told her was not substantiated." The room temperature didn't change. It felt like it did. Gersh cleared his throat. "The accusation came from—" "I know where the accusation came from." The colonel's voice was flat. "I'm asking where the decision came from." Silence. The JAG officer wrote something, just 2 words, maybe 3. The scratch of the pen was loud enough that both Lyle and Gersh tracked it involuntarily, which was probably the point. Downstairs, the emergency department had found a rhythm. Not a good rhythm, not the clean, efficient rhythm of a department operating within its capacity, but the functional rhythm of people who have stopped expecting normal and have started managing exceptional. Tomas Rea was running Bay 4 and Bay 7 simultaneously and losing ground on neither, which said something about him that most people in this hospital hadn't noticed. 2 residents had pulled together in the sort of spontaneous coordination that disasters produce in people who are actually competent, the kind of teamwork that only happens when the organizational chart becomes irrelevant and people just do what needs doing. Rachel was at the center of it, not because she had been reinstated. She hadn't technically. No one had cleared that paperwork, and the paperwork was in a room 2 floors up. But because she was there and she knew what she was doing, and the department needed that more than it needed proper documentation of authority. Tomas had handed her a pair of gloves without comment when she'd come back to the floor, and that was the whole negotiation. She was working Bay 9 now. A 47-year-old woman from the bus, Teresa Macklin, who had a fractured collarbone, a lacerated forearm, and the specific emotional state of someone whose adrenaline had fully metabolized into shock. Her hands were shaking, not from the injury, from the realization of what had almost happened, which was its own kind of wound. "You're okay," Rachel said. She was cleaning the forearm laceration, and her hands were steady in the way her hands always got steady when there was work to do. "The collarbone is going to hurt for 6 weeks. The arm is 3 stitches, maybe 4. You're going to be fine." Teresa Macklin was looking at the ceiling. "There were kids on that bus." "I know, they're in other bays. They're all being looked at." "A little girl was sitting across from me. She couldn't have been more than, I don't know, 8, 9. Rachel kept her hands moving. "What's her name? The little girl?" I don't know. I never got—" "I'll find out," Rachel said. "We'll have her name for you before you leave this bay, okay?" Teresa Macklin's eyes came down from the ceiling and found Rachel's face. "Okay," she said. Her hands were still shaking, but less. Rachel finished the cleaning and reached for the suture kit. She was aware, at the edges of her concentration, that Sandra Breck had appeared in the hallway outside Bay 9, was watching, and had not yet decided what to do with that decision. Rachel didn't address it. The moment she made Sandra's presence into a thing that required a response, it would become one. She threaded the needle. "Close your eyes if you don't like this part," she told Teresa. "Does it hurt?" "Little bit, less than you're expecting." Teresa closed her eyes. Rachel worked. The second folder contained 47 pages. Colonel Marsh had not compiled it. Her office had received it, 2 weeks ago, forwarded through channels from a source that the colonel was not yet required to name, and had spent 10 days verifying it before scheduling a visit to Marlow that was supposed to be a routine check on the medical support infrastructure for the regional training facility. The highway accident had accelerated everything. Among the 47 pages, incident reports that had been altered after filing. 3 of them. Each alteration was small and would have been easy to miss individually. A changed medication dosage and a post-incident summary, a timestamp adjusted by 11 minutes in a complaint log, a witness name removed from a filing that had originally contained 4 and now contained 3. Small things. The kind of small things that were only visible when you put them next to the originals, which someone had preserved, and which were now in the folder, side by side with the altered versions on pages marked with yellow tape. There was also a complaint, not from a patient, from a nurse, filed 8 months ago through the hospital's internal reporting system and logged as received, and then 48 hours later marked resolved, no action required, by an administrator whose initials on the resolution form were PG, Paul Gersh, sat in the conference room chair and looked at those initials on the copy, now open in front of him, and appeared to be doing the math on a number of things simultaneously. The complaint had been filed by Rachel Hayes. The complaint had alleged that a medication error, a serious one, the kind that could have killed the 68-year-old patient who received the wrong dosage, had been documented incorrectly in the incident report, and that the documentation error appeared to be deliberate. The complaint had been buried 8 months ago. "She filed this in November," the JAG officer said. He wasn't asking. Gersh said nothing. "And 2 weeks after she filed it," the JAG officer continued, "she was moved from her regular bay assignments to the rotating schedule, which meant she was no longer working with the team that had been involved in the incident." Lyle was very still. "That's standard rotation," Gersh said. His voice had the quality of something being said purely because silence would be worse. "Standard rotation that happened to remove the reporting nurse from proximity to the incident team within 17 days of her filing a formal complaint." The JAG officer made another note. "Okay?" Colonel Marsh was looking at Lyle, just looking at him, with no expression that could be characterized as anything other than attention. "The dog tags," Lyle said. He said it like a man pulling a thread he hopes will unravel the right sweater. "The accusation about the tags was made by Sandra Breck, who has worked in this department for 11 years under your direct supervision, on the same afternoon that Hayes was showing increasing visibility among the incoming trauma team and likely would have been the senior nursing voice on a mass casualty response." The colonel paused. Timing is interesting. Lyle looked at her. I want to be very clear about something, she said. I'm not here because one of my former officers was embarrassed in an emergency room. I'm here because I have 23 Marines in this building and I needed to know the quality of the institution treating them. And the material in that folder, which was provided to my office by someone in this hospital who had been watching this situation for some time, tells me something specific about this institution's quality. Are you following me? Lyle was following her. He had gone the color of old concrete. Who provided it? Gersh said. Not quite a question. That's not your concern right now. The colonel closed the folder. Your concern right now is the statement you're going to give, which should begin with a complete account of the November complaint and what happened to it. Lyle looked at the closed folder. He looked at Gersh. Something passed between them. Not communication exactly, but the recognition of a shared position, which was they were in it, and the only question was the depth. Gersh put both hands on the table. I want to call the hospital's legal counsel, he said. That's your right, the JAG officer said. Make the call. Gersh reached for his phone. Lyle sat without moving, staring at the closed folder, and did not reach for his. Bob. At 4:12 p.m., Donnie Ferris came out of surgery. Rachel was outside the surgical suite when they wheeled him through. She had no real reason to be there except that she had been the one to catch it, and there was something in her that needed to see the outcome. The surgeon, Dr. Okafor, who was a compact woman with close-cropped gray at her temples, and the specific efficient body language of someone who has been doing this for 20 years, stopped when she saw Rachel. Spleen, she said, partial resection. He's going to be sore for 2 months, but he'll be fine. Blood pressure stabilized? Stable in the suite. BP is good. Okafor studied her for a moment. Tomas told me who caught it. Rachel said nothing. Nice catch, Okafor said. She said it the way surgeons say these things. Compressed, professional, the only version of effusive that the surgical personality allows. Rachel nodded. Okafor moved on. Rachel stood in the hallway outside the surgical suite for a moment, looking at the closed doors, and then turned and walked back toward the ER. She passed the elevator bank. Colonel Marsh was stepping off the elevator. The colonel had left the conference room, which meant either the conversation upstairs was over or it had reached a stage that required something the room didn't have. She was alone, no aide, no JAG officer, and she looked at Rachel with the specific directness of someone who has wanted to have a conversation and has been waiting for the logistical opening. How's the Marine? She asked. Surgery went well, partial spleen resection. He'll recover. The colonel nodded. She looked at Rachel the way she had looked at her in the parking lot, that assessing, categorizing look that felt less like scrutiny than like recognition. You knew as soon as you looked at him. His pressure was dropping at a rate that said something was bleeding that the external exam wasn't showing, and the mechanism of injury was right for it. How long did you have? Rachel considered. Another 8 minutes, maybe 10, before it became a harder problem. The colonel was quiet for a moment. The hallway was one of those middle-floor hospital hallways. Not as busy as the ER, not as quiet as the administrative wing, a place where people moved through rather than stayed. An orderly pushed a cart past them. A resident walked by with a coffee cup and the expression of someone managing their second consecutive night shift. I read your file 4 years ago, the colonel said, when you were transitioning out. Rachel kept her expression neutral. I didn't know that. Your commanding officer flagged you. He thought we were losing someone we'd have trouble replacing. A pause. He wasn't wrong. I needed to come home. I know. The colonel said it without judgment, which was the version of it that Rachel could accept. I'm not second-guessing that. I'm telling you I know who you are, and I know what you did in that bay today, and I know what they did to you this afternoon. And the 2 things that happened in this building today, those 2 things don't belong in the same institution. Rachel was quiet for a moment. She was working out what to do with that sentence, which was complicated and true, and not the kind of thing she was used to hearing said to her plainly. What's in the second folder? She said. It wasn't quite a question. The colonel looked at her steadily. Your November complaint, the altered incident reports. Some additional material that suggests the November complaint was not the first time documentation was adjusted in this department. Rachel felt the particular internal sensation of hearing something confirmed that she had suspected but had not let herself fully form. It was not relief. It was not satisfaction. It was something heavier than both. "How long?" she said. "The documentation we've traced goes back about 3 years, but we think the practice is older than that." 3 years. Rachel did the math on 3 years of altered incident reports in an emergency department, on what that meant for patients who had passed through this department in 3 years, on what she hadn't been able to see because she'd only been here for 14 months and had spent most of that time working her own assignments and keeping her head down. She had not kept her head down enough. "The complaint in November," she said. "The patient was 68 years old. She got the wrong dosage of a blood thinner, and her chart was adjusted after the fact to make it look like the right dosage had been administered. We know. She didn't die, but she could have. We know that too." Rachel looked down the hallway toward the ER doors, where she could hear the familiar sounds of the department still running. "There was another incident before I filed, about 2 months before. Different patient, similar situation. I reported it verbally to Sandra Breck, and she told me the chart would be reviewed, and I never heard anything about it again." The colonel was very still. "That wasn't in the file we received. Because I never filed it formally. Sandra told me it was handled, and I—" Rachel stopped. "I should have filed it formally." She said it flatly. Not self-pity, not self-flagellation. The simple factual acknowledgement of someone doing an honest post-mortem on a decision. She should have filed it. She hadn't. That was true. "You did file eventually," the colonel said, 8 months ago. "And it was buried. And I was moved to rotating shifts and nobody said anything to my face, which is a particular kind of answer." Rachel looked at the colonel. "I didn't connect Sandra's accusation today to the complaint until about 30 minutes ago. I connected them about 6 hours before I walked into this parking lot." Something shifted in Rachel's chest. Not warmth exactly. She was not the kind of person who moved easily to warmth, but the particular sensation of not being alone in a thing you had been alone in for 8 months. "What happens now?" she said. "Now we go back downstairs and finish the mass casualty response, because there are still 17 patients in your emergency department, and some of them need a trauma nurse." The colonel straightened slightly. "After that, what happens involves people with more authority than me and more documentation than one folder. But the first thing is finishing the job." Rachel nodded. They walked toward the elevator. The colonel said, as they stepped in, "The tags." Rachel's hand moved to her chest where the chain lay. "Aldrin was in my regiment," the colonel said. "Not directly under my command, but in my regiment. I knew him." Rachel looked at the elevator doors. "He was a good Marine," the colonel said. "What he did, giving those to you, that was the right call." The elevator opened on the ground floor. Rachel stepped out first. "He always made the right call," she said, "until the last one." She walked toward the ER without looking back, and the colonel walked behind her, and neither of them said anything further on the subject because nothing further needed to be said. What Sandra Breck was doing at 4:27 p.m. was something she had not done in 11 years at Pine Valley Medical Center, which was standing in the women's restroom near the staff lounge with her back against the tile wall, trying to work out the shape of what was happening. She was not a stupid woman. She had never been a stupid woman. She had built 11 years of professional standing through a combination of genuine competence and strategic positioning, and she understood systems in the way that people understand systems when they have survived inside them long enough. She had understood, when she pulled those tags, that she was initiating something. She had expected that something to be contained. A suspension, an investigation, a quiet resolution. She had not expected Marine Corps vehicles in the parking lot. She had not expected a colonel. She had not expected the JAG officer whose presence, a military lawyer at a civilian hospital, indicated a level of institutional involvement that went considerably beyond a dispute about dog tags. Sandra Breck, alone in the restroom, performed the calculation that she had been avoiding for most of the afternoon. The November complaint. Rachel had filed it in November, and it had been marked resolved, and Sandra had understood, when she received the resolution notification, that it had been handled in the way that things were handled at Pine Valley, quietly, without consequence for the people who had needed it to go away. She had not altered the incident report herself. She had not asked Gersh to bury the complaint herself. But she had known. She had been the nursing supervisor on the shift when the medication error occurred, and she had known the error, and she had known the report was going to be adjusted, and she had said nothing. And then Rachel had filed the complaint, and Sandra had received a call from Gersh that she had chosen to interpret as an administrative courtesy, and 14 days later Rachel had been moved to rotating shifts, and Sandra had allowed herself to believe that the situation was resolved. She had pulled those tags today for reasons she was now examining with a clarity she did not find comfortable. She had pulled them because Rachel Hayes, back in the department during a mass casualty, would be the most visible and most effective person in the room. Because if Rachel Hayes ran this response and ran it well, it would raise questions about why Rachel Hayes was on rotating shifts, about why Rachel Hayes had filed a complaint in November that had been quietly closed, about what Rachel Hayes knew. Sandra turned on the faucet and ran cold water over her wrists, which was an old habit from nursing school that she hadn't revisited in years. Her reflection in the mirror showed her something she didn't examine too long. When she came back to the floor, two things were happening simultaneously. Rachel Hayes was at the nursing station, in scrubs, with a patient chart open, giving directions to a resident in the particular tone of someone who has not been suspended, which meant something had changed or was in the process of changing on the second floor. And Tomas Rea was looking at Sandra with an expression that she had never seen on his face before, which was the expression of someone who knows something and has decided they no longer feel the need to pretend they don't. "Tomas," she said, "what's the status on Bay 12? "Bay 12 is covered." He didn't look away from her. "The colonel's aide is looking for you." Sandra went still. "For me specifically?" "For you specifically." His voice was even, which was worse than if it hadn't been. She looked at Rachel, who had not looked up from the chart. "Where's the aide?" Sandra said. Tomas pointed toward the family consultation room near the ER entrance. Sandra walked toward it the way you walk toward something when you have no better option, which is to say with your chin up and your pace even, and your mind running 3 steps ahead of your feet trying to find the ground. The aide's name was Lieutenant Ferraro, and he was 27 and had the specific quality of someone young who has been trained by older people who are very good at their jobs. He stood when Sandra came in. He thanked her for coming. He offered her a seat. All of this was courtesy, but it was the kind of courtesy that has steel inside it. He had 3 questions. The questions were, when had Sandra Breck first become aware of Rachel Hayes' November complaint? What was the nature of Sandra Breck's professional relationship with Paul Gersh? And on the shift in question in November, the shift when the medication error occurred, had Sandra Breck been the supervising nurse? Sandra answered the first 2 questions carefully. She answered the third one, after a pause of approximately 4 seconds, by saying she'd like to speak with the hospital's legal counsel before continuing. Lieutenant Ferraro nodded and made a note and said that was completely her right. He said it the same way the JAG officer had said it to Gersh, which was with complete neutrality and the particular cadence of someone writing down what is about to happen next. Sandra sat in the consultation room after Ferraro left and looked at the motivational poster on the wall. A mountain, a sunrise, a sentence about teamwork that had probably seemed appropriate to whoever chose it, and allowed herself briefly the private experience of understanding that the things she had set in motion this afternoon had a trajectory she had not planned for and could not now redirect. She thought about the tags hitting the floor, the sound they had made. At 5:04 p.m., the last of the critical bus patients was stabilized. Rachel stood in the center of the ER and did the count she always did at the end of a mass casualty, the specific, private accounting of who came in and what state they were in and what state they were in now. 19 critical on arrival, 19 accounted for, 3 in surgery, all successful, 16 stabilized in bays or transferred to floors, 2 pediatric patients, both stable. The 8-year-old girl, her name was Molly Vickers, traveling with her grandparents, who were both now in rooms on the 3rd floor with moderate injuries, was in the pediatric observation bay with a wrapped wrist and a hospital-issue stuffed animal, and the specific exhausted calm of a child who has been frightened past the point of further fright and has come out the other side into something like sleep. Rachel had stopped in to check on Molly Vickers at 4:55 p.m. She had reported the name and room number to Teresa Macklin in Bay 9, as promised. Teresa had cried a little, which was fine. Now Rachel stood at the nursing station in the specific state of post-mass casualty that she recognized from other contexts. The way the body keeps the elevated state running longer than the emergency does. The way ordinary sounds seem briefly loud. The way your hands feel strange without something to do. She was filling out chart documentation that was overdue by 2 hours, and that she was filing under the not fully resolved question of her own employment status. Tomas appeared beside her. He set a cup of coffee on the counter without comment. Rachel looked at it. She didn't typically drink coffee this late. She picked it up. "You should know," Tomas said quietly, not looking at her, looking at his own charting, "that I'm the one who provided the documentation to the colonel's office." Rachel's hands were still. "The incidents," he said. "I kept copies. I'd been keeping copies since before you filed the complaint in November. I filed mine through a different channel. I didn't know if it would go anywhere. I sent what I had to a veteran advocacy organization, and they forwarded it to the Marine Corps liaison because of the regional facility connection." Rachel looked at him. He was still looking at his chart. His jaw was set in the way it's set when he was managing something difficult. "You didn't tell me," she said. "I didn't tell you because if I told you, you'd either confront it directly, and they'd find a way to use it against you, or you'd worry about me, and I didn't need you worried about me." He paused. "I know that wasn't your call to make. I'm sorry I made it for you." Rachel held the coffee cup with both hands and looked at the counter. "How long have you been keeping copies?" she said. 2 years. 2 years. Before Rachel had arrived, before Rachel had filed anything. Tomas Rea had been watching this for 2 years and documenting it alone and carrying it alone and showing up for every shift with a face that gave away nothing. "Tomas," she said, "I know." "No, I mean—" She stopped. She did not have a sentence for what she meant, which was something in the range of, "I've been here 14 months and I thought I was alone in this, and I wasn't, and I didn't know, and I'm not sure what to do with that." She was not someone who had sentences for those things. She was working on it. He handed her a pen. "Bay 11 needs a countersignature." She took the pen. They went back to work. At 5:41 p.m., the conference room on the second floor reached the end of what it was going to yield without legal counsel, and the JAG officer closed his notebook and told Lyle and Gersh that he'd be back in the morning. Lyle walked him to the elevator. On the way back to the conference room, he passed a window that looked down into the ER, and he stopped. Below, the department had thinned to a manageable rhythm. The bays were visible from above. The light was different in the late afternoon, yellow and flat, making the clinical space look simultaneously more ordinary and more stark. He could see Bay 4, Bay 7, the nursing station at the center. He could see Tomas Rea writing at the station. He could see 2 residents doing something with a chart. And he could see Rachel Hayes in the middle of it, not running, not performing, just there in the specific bodily way of someone who belongs somewhere, moving between a bay and the station with a chart in her hand, saying something to a resident that made him nod and adjust whatever he was doing. The whole interaction taking maybe 15 seconds and accomplishing something that would have taken Lyle 3 minutes to coordinate administratively. He stood at the window for longer than he'd intended. He had known, when Sandra came to him this afternoon, that the accusation was imperfect. He had known the timing was opportune. He had made the calculation that the risk of Rachel Hayes continuing to have a visible presence in the department, continuing to be the kind of nurse who noticed things and filed things and made other people nervous, outweighed the risk of an accusation that didn't fully hold. He had been wrong about that. He had been wrong about a great many things, and the shape of how wrong was still becoming clear to him, which was its own particular kind of terrible. He turned from the window. Down the corridor, his office door was open. Inside, his desk, his credentials on the wall, his photographs from 3 hospital ribbon cuttings, and 2 industry awards and 1 framed newspaper profile from 7 years ago when Pine Valley had won a regional patient care award. He went in. He sat down. He looked at the phone on his desk. Then he looked at the drawer on the left side, where his own personal file folder had lived for 3 years, the one that contained his own copies of things, Not the altered versions, the originals. The ones he had kept because you always keep the originals. Because there is always a version of events where you need the originals. He opened the drawer. The folder was not there. He stared at the empty space where it had been. He opened the drawer fully, checked behind it, checked the adjacent drawer. He stood and looked through the credenza behind the desk. He went through the motions that people go through when something is not where they put it, performing the search as if location were the problem and not the answer he was arriving at. The folder was gone. His door was still open. He looked at the hallway. At the nursing station 1 floor below, at the center of the department she was not supposed to be in, Rachel Hayes had not taken the folder. She had been on the sidewalk, then in the department, then in the surgical suite hallway, then back in the department, and she had not been near his office. But someone had been. Someone had known where to look and had known when to look, and had moved through the administrative wing while the mass casualty occupied every camera and every pair of eyes that might otherwise have been watching. Lyle sat down in his chair. His hands were very still on the desk. His office had the particular silence of a room that has just become a different kind of room than it was an hour ago. The same furniture, the same walls, the same light, but the coordinates of everything inside it shifted in a way that could not be shifted back. His personal cell phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. The message was from a number he recognized, the hospital board chair, which meant news had traveled faster than he had calculated, which meant someone had made a call before the JAG officer's car had even left the parking lot. The message said, "Call me, now." Garrison Lyle looked at his phone. He looked at the empty drawer. He looked at the window, and through it, at the last gray light of the Marlowe afternoon, and below that, somewhere in the building, the emergency department was still running, and the nurse he had tried to remove from it was still there, and every minute she stayed was a minute the department ran better than it had run before she walked in, and that fact had weight, and the weight was not going anywhere. He picked up his phone. His thumb hovered over the board chair's name. He put the phone down. He picked up the desk phone instead, the hospital's internal line, the one that connected to the department heads, the one that had his own name attached to it, still, for now, and he held the receiver for a moment and then set it down too. From down the hall, his assistant's voice carried, slightly elevated. "Dr. Lyle, there are 2 people here from the Oregon State Medical Board." The Oregon State Medical Board. Not the colonel, not the JAG officer, not the board chair. The State Medical Board, which operated on its own timeline and its own authority, which had its own investigators and its own procedures, and whose presence here, tonight, within hours, meant that someone had made a call that was not the JAG officer and not the colonel, a call that had been placed before the convoy pulled into the parking lot by someone who had been waiting for exactly the right moment and had decided this afternoon was it. 2 years of copies. Lyle understood now exactly what Tomas Rea had built, and when he'd built it and who he'd called. "Tell them I'll be right there," Lyle said. His voice came out level. He was surprised by that. He stood. He straightened his jacket, which was the motion of a man performing composure for an audience of 0. In the emergency department below, the night shift was beginning. Rachel Hayes was handing off to the incoming nursing team, not because she'd been cleared for a full shift, not because anything was formally resolved, but because the department needed continuity, and she knew the cases and the incoming nurses needed the briefing. She was giving that briefing now, going bed by bed with the systematic efficiency of someone who has done this in conditions where getting it wrong meant someone died. The Oregon State Medical Board investigators were waiting in the hallway outside Lyle's office. The folder was gone from the drawer. The board chair's text was still on his personal phone, unanswered. And somewhere in the building, in a consultation room near the ER entrance, Sandra Breck was waiting for hospital legal counsel to arrive, sitting with her hands in her lap and the specific posture of someone who has spent 11 years building a professional identity and is now watching the structure of it develop cracks that start small and do not stop. Garrison Lyle walked out of his office. He shook hands with the investigators. "Of course," he said. "Come in." His smile was the kind that doesn't reach anything. The smile didn't last long. The first investigator, a woman named Calloway, mid-40s, The kind of flat affect that comes from spending years looking at things institutions would prefer stayed hidden, set a tablet on Lyle's conference table before he'd fully settled into his chair. The second investigator was younger, male, said nothing, and wrote continuously in a spiral notebook that he'd produced from his jacket pocket before the door was closed. "We're here under an expedited review order," Calloway said, "which you can verify through the board's main office if you'd like to make that call. I'd recommend making it after this conversation rather than during." "I'm familiar with expedited reviews," Lyle said. "Good. Then you know they're issued when a board member receives credible documentation of an ongoing patient safety risk." She turned the tablet to face him. "We received that documentation at 11:47 this morning." Lyle looked at the tablet. The screen showed the first page of a filing, this. Dense, formatted, with attachments. He recognized the structure. He did not recognize the filing itself, which meant it had not come through any channel he had access to. "Who filed this?" he said. "The filing is confidential at this stage." Calloway pulled the tablet back. "What I can tell you is that it references 3 separate incident reports filed between 14 and 38 months ago, each of which exists in 2 versions, the version in your system and the version that was filed with the board tonight as the original." The younger investigator was writing. Lyle said nothing. "We'd like access to your records management system," Calloway said. "Tonight. We'd like it before the morning shift begins, because once morning shift begins, access logs become more complicated to isolate. We have the order." She slid a document across the table, printed, signed, stamped. "We need a system administrator's credentials, and we need them in the next 20 minutes, or we return with a broader order that includes your personnel files, financial records, and vendor contracts." Lyle looked at the order. He looked at his hands. He thought about the folder that was not in his drawer, and the board chair's text he had not answered, and the JAG officer who had said, "I'll be back in the morning," with the particular certainty of someone who knows the morning will be different from the afternoon. "I'll get you your administrator," he said. Downstairs, the shift change had created temporary overlap of bodies in the nursing station. The outgoing team briefing the incoming, 2 nurses sharing a terminal, the specific productive noise of institutional knowledge being transferred in compressed, efficient bursts. Rachel was at the far end of the station, 3 charts still open in front of her, finishing notations she'd been working through for the past 40 minutes. She heard the footsteps before she looked up. Colonel Marsh, and behind her, Lieutenant Ferraro, moving with the coordinated pace of people who have had a conversation that has changed the shape of the next hour. Rachel put down her pen. "The State Medical Board is upstairs," the colonel said, not quietly, but not loudly. The nursing station noise absorbed it. "I know, Tomas told me." The colonel looked at her with an expression that was not surprise. "You knew about the filing." "I knew about Tomas. I didn't know when." Rachel looked at the charts in front of her. "He's been carrying this for 2 years. The filing is thorough." The colonel paused. "It's very thorough. Whoever helped him put it together knew what they were doing. He's a good nurse. Good nurses document everything." A beat of quiet. Ferraro was looking at the ER entrance, the professional detachment of someone giving 2 people space they haven't asked for. "Rachel." The colonel said it the way she'd said it in the parking lot. Not ranked, not formal, just the name. "The board investigators are going to want to talk to you before they leave tonight. Your complaint from November is part of the filing." "I know." "What you tell them on the record, I know what I'm going to tell them." Rachel looked up. "The same thing I put in the complaint 8 months ago, and the same things I've been watching since. I should have filed more formally the first time. I didn't. I'm going to say that too because it's true." The colonel studied her for a moment. "You're not going to protect yourself first." "I'm going to tell the truth first." Rachel picked up her pen. "Protecting myself is what happens after." Something in the colonel's face shifted. Not softened exactly, but acknowledged. Like she'd confirmed something she'd expected and hadn't been fully certain of until now. "There's one more thing," Ferraro said. He stepped forward and produced a folder, thin, just a few pages, and set it on the counter beside Rachel's charts. Security footage from the ER, the camera above the nursing station, timestamped today at 14:22. Rachel looked at the folder. It's a still capture, Ferraro said. From 8 seconds of footage. Dr. Lyle is visible in the frame. He's speaking with Sandra Breck. The timestamp is 4 minutes before she approached you. Rachel did not open the folder immediately. He knew, she said. Not a question. He was on camera gesturing toward you and then gesturing toward his own chest. Ferraro was precise, careful. We're not characterizing what the footage shows. That's for the investigators. But we wanted you to have it before you went in. Rachel opened the folder. The still was grainy. Hospital security cameras always were. But clear enough. Lyle. Breck. The angle was from above and to the left, which meant their faces were partially visible, which meant the gesture was partially visible. Lyle's hand at his own sternum, fingers spread, in the specific position of someone indicating a necklace or a chain. 4 minutes before Sandra Breck had crossed the ER and grabbed Rachel's tags. Rachel closed the folder. She put both hands flat on the counter. Her jaw was tight, and her breathing was even, and she was doing the thing she had learned to do in much louder, more dangerous situations than this, running the shock through her body and out the other side without letting it stop anywhere it could become something she couldn't use. "Where is Sandra now?" she said. "Still in the consultation room near the entrance," Ferraro said, "waiting for legal." Rachel looked toward the ER entrance. The consultation room door was closed. Through the small window set into it, she could see the shape of Sandra Breck sitting in a chair with her hands in her lap. "And Lyle. With the board investigators." Ferraro paused. "He's been very cooperative." The way he said cooperative had the specific dry quality of someone who means he's talking because he thinks talking will help, and it won't. Rachel nodded. She picked up her charts. She went back to the documentation she hadn't finished because there were patients attached to these charts, and the patients needed the notes completed correctly, and that mattered regardless of what was happening on the second floor and in the consultation room and in the parking lot where the Marine Corps vehicles were still sitting in their deliberate geometry. Tomas appeared at her elbow 10 minutes later. He set a second cup of coffee beside her without comment. She looked at it. She looked at him. "The board investigators want to see us at 1900, he said. "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "You doing okay?" Rachel considered the question with the straightforward attention she gave most things. "I'm doing fine." "You sure?" "I'm sure." She glanced at him sideways. "You've been carrying this for 2 years alone. Are you doing okay?" He looked at his own charts. "I will be." That was the whole conversation. It was enough. But at 6:48 p.m., Sandra Breck's legal counsel arrived, a hospital-contracted attorney who had clearly been on another call when he was reached and had not yet been told the full scope of what he was walking into. Rachel saw him cross the ER toward the consultation room, watched the specific moment when he glanced at the Marine Corps aide standing near the entrance with a folder under his arm, and registered that this situation was something different from what he'd been briefed for. He recovered quickly, but not before his face had done the thing faces do when a professional realizes they are 2 steps behind where they needed to be. The consultation room door opened. Sandra looked up. The attorney introduced himself. He sat. He set his briefcase on the table. He asked Sandra, in the standard opening of every attorney in every difficult room, "Before we begin, is there anything I need to know?" The silence that followed lasted approximately 6 seconds. Sandra Breck looked at her hands. She looked at the motivational mountain poster. She looked at the door, as if the door might offer an alternative she hadn't considered. Then she looked at the attorney and said quietly, "Yes, there is." The attorney opened his briefcase, and outside the consultation room, in the main ER corridor, the doors to the ambulance bay opened and a paramedic came through at a pace that was not the pace of a routine transfer. It was faster, tighter, the specific forward lean of someone who has something that cannot wait. Behind the gurney, a patient Rachel did not recognize, male, 60s, in civilian clothes, with the pallor and irregular breathing of someone in acute cardiac distress. Behind the paramedic, a second EMT calling vitals, and behind him, 2 people in plain clothes who were not medical and were not family, the particular alert, scanning attention of law enforcement, who stayed at the door without entering but watched the gurney's path with the focused tracking of people who had been accompanying this patient and had a professional reason to know where he ended up. Rachel moved without deciding to move, gloves off the dispenser, toward the incoming bay. Tomas looked at the two plainclothes figures at the door. He looked at Rachel. He looked at the paramedic who was now calling the patient's name, loudly, trying to maintain responsiveness. And the name was not a name Rachel recognized, but the face was. She had seen it once, briefly, in a photograph in a file that she had not been supposed to see and had seen anyway 8 months ago, during the 48 hours between filing her November complaint and receiving the notification that it had been marked resolved. The face in the photograph had been attached to a name, not this patient's name, a different name, a name that had appeared in the altered incident reports as the physician who had signed off on the corrected chart. Her hand slowed on the glove. She looked again. There was no question. The face was the same. She turned to the paramedic. What happened? Found him in a parking garage 2 blocks over. No ID on him. Witness said he collapsed. BP is low, rhythm is irregular. He was conscious on arrival and then... The paramedic shook his head. He said something before he went under. What did he say? The paramedic looked at her. He said, tell them the original charts are in the Morrow building. And then he was out. The ER went on around them. Monitors and voices and the specific noise of the department doing its job. Rachel was very still at the center of it. The Morrow building was 2 miles from Pine Valley Medical Center. It had been a medical record storage facility until 3 years ago, when Pine Valley had contracted an off-site vendor for record management, and the Morrow building had been listed in a budget report as vacated. The 2 plainclothes officers at the ambulance bay door were watching her face. She understood, in the specific crystalline way that certain moments become clear all at once, that the man on the gurney was not a coincidence, and the parking garage was not a coincidence, and the 2 officers at the door were not standard medical escort. Get me a line, and get me Okafor, she said, moving, and someone needs to call Colonel Marsh. The second glove snapped. She went to work. The cardiac rhythm on the monitor was atrial fibrillation with a ventricular rate that was too fast and too irregular, the kind of rhythm that looks manageable until it isn't. Rachel worked the bay with the focused efficiency of someone who has set aside everything that happened in the last 4 hours and is operating purely in the present tense, which was the skill she had built over years in conditions that didn't allow for anything else. Dr. Okafor arrived in 3 minutes, which was fast. She took 1 look at the monitor, 1 look at the patient, and came to the same conclusions Rachel had already reached. Cardioversion? Not yet. Rate control first. His pressure is low enough that I want to try medication before we shock him. Rachel had the IV established, was already drawing up the dosage. He was conscious on arrival. He's not now, which means this moved faster than the paramedic's timeline suggests. Or it moved at exactly the rate it was always going to move. Okafor took the patient's wrist. How old? Paramedic estimated mid-60s. No ID. Okafor looked at the 2 plainclothes officers still visible through the bay window, standing in the corridor with the careful positioning of people who are waiting for something and are trying not to look like they are. Who are they? I don't know yet. Rachel administered the medication, watched the monitor. But he said something before he went under, something about charts. Okafor looked at her sharply. I know, Rachel said. Does the colonel know? Ferraro is getting her. They worked in the compressed, focused silence of 2 people who are good at the same thing and have established in 3 minutes of shared emergency that they don't need to narrate their decisions to each other. The medication was going in. The rate was coming down, slowly, not as fast as either of them wanted. The patient's blood pressure held at a number that was uncomfortable but workable. At 7 minutes, his eyes opened. Not fully. A partial opening, the specific unfocused quality of someone returning from unconsciousness through several layers of confusion. He looked at the ceiling, then at Rachel. Hey, she said. Calm, even. You're in an emergency room. You're okay. What's your name? His lips moved. It took a moment to become words. Pritchard. Mr. Pritchard, I'm Rachel. We're working on your heart rhythm. You're stable. She kept her voice level and unhurried, which was a deliberate choice. Panic in the patient's first conscious moments could spike the rate back up. You said something when you came in. about charts, about the Morrow building. His eyes sharpened. It happened fast, faster than she'd expected. The shift from confusion to alertness that told her the confusion had been physical, not cognitive. His mind was clear. He'd been waiting to be conscious. "How much do you know?" he said. His voice was rough, dry. "Enough to be asking." He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Something moved through his face that was not fear exactly, but occupied adjacent territory. "I was the one who signed the corrections." The bay was quiet except for the monitor. "I know," Rachel said. "Lyle brought me in 3 years ago. Consulting arrangement. Officially, I was doing compliance review. What I was actually doing—" He stopped, swallowed. His eyes came back to her face. "I need to talk to whoever is running this investigation. There are state board investigators in this building right now. Not them." He said it with the specific emphasis of someone who knows which authority applies to their situation. "Military. I need the military investigator." Rachel looked at Okafor. Okafor had the expression of a person watching a situation exceed its expected parameters for the second time in one afternoon. "Keep his rate controlled," Rachel said. "I'll be back in 4 minutes." She stripped off her gloves and walked out of the bay. Colonel Marsh was already in the corridor. She had the particular alertness of someone who has been moving quickly and has arrived at the right place and is now waiting to hear what the right place contains. Rachel gave her the summary in 40 seconds. Patient name Pritchard, cardiac event, stable, was conscious briefly. Former consulting physician for Pine Valley's compliance function, signed the altered charts, asking specifically for military investigators. The colonel's expression did not change during any of this. She listened with the complete attention of someone who is filing, sorting, and connecting simultaneously. "Why military vaisseau?" she said when Rachel finished. "He didn't say, but he said it with intention." Rachel paused. "The 2 plainclothes officers who came in with him, they're law enforcement. They were in that parking garage for a reason." Colonel Marsh looked toward the bay. Then she looked at Ferraro, who had appeared at her shoulder. "Find out who those 2 are," she said. Quietly. Ferraro moved. "And you," the colonel said to Rachel, "go back in there and keep him stable. I need him conscious and I need him talking, in that order." Rachel went back in. Ferraro returned in 6 minutes with an answer that changed the geometry of the evening. The 2 plainclothes officers were not local police. They were federal, specifically investigators from the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General, which handled fraud and abuse investigations in healthcare institutions. They had been in that parking garage because they had been following Pritchard for 11 days, not as a suspect, but as a potential cooperating witness in an existing federal investigation into healthcare billing fraud in 3 Oregon medical facilities. Pine Valley Medical Center was one of the 3. The federal investigation had been running for 7 months. It had started not with altered incident reports, and not with medication errors, but with billing irregularities. The specific, dense, deliberately obfuscated kind of billing irregularities that only become visible when someone with financial forensics experience sits down with enough data and enough time. Someone had done that sitting. Someone in the HHSOIG's regional office had looked at Pine Valley's Medicare billing patterns over a 4-year period and had found what they politely called anomalies, and what a less polite person would call a systematic fraud operation running through the same administrative layer that had been altering incident reports and burying nursing complaints. The altered charts were not primarily about covering medical errors. They were about billing. The corrected documentation, the versions in Pine Valley's system with the adjusted timestamps and the changed medication records, corresponded in each case to billing submissions that had been inflated or mischaracterized. The incident reports were being altered not to protect staff from malpractice claims, but to ensure that the billing submissions aligned with documentation, which meant that if anyone ever audited the billing, they would find charts that matched and would stop looking. Tomas had not known this part. His copies were the originals, the real incident reports, and he had preserved them because he understood they were being altered, but he had not known why, because the billing connection was invisible without the financial records, and the financial records were not something a bedside nurse had access to. When Colonel Marsh heard this summary in the ER corridor at 7:22 p.m., she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How much?" Ferraro had gotten a number from the federal investigators, who had given it as a preliminary estimate. Approximately $4.3 million over 4 years. The quiet that followed was not empty. It was the specific quality of silence that forms around a number that is large enough to explain everything. The suppressed complaints, the rotated staff, the buried documentation, the willingness to publicly humiliate a nurse over a pair of dog tags, rather than risk having her visible and credible in a mass casualty event that would draw outside attention. $4.3 million bought a particular level of institutional protection. "Lyle," Colonel Marsh said. "He's still with the board investigators upstairs." Ferraro paused. "He doesn't know about the federal case. The OIG investigators had not disclosed to the state board yet. Tonight was supposed to be surveillance. They were tracking Pritchard to see who he'd contact. They didn't expect a cardiac event." "Nobody ever does." The colonel looked toward the administrative corridor. "How long before they go up?" "They're waiting on a supervisor's authorization for the expanded operation. 30 minutes, maybe 40. 30 to 40 minutes in which Garrison Lyle was in a conference room on the second floor, cooperating with state board investigators, with no knowledge that the conversation he thought was the worst thing happening to him tonight was approximately 1/3 of what was actually happening. Colonel Marsh turned to Rachel, who had come back out of the bay. "Pritchard," she said. "Can he talk?" "His rhythm is stabilized, rate is controlled, he's alert." Rachel looked at the bay window. "He's been waiting to be alert." "I need 5 minutes with him." "You have 5 minutes, not more." Rachel met her eyes. "His heart has been through enough today." The colonel almost smiled. It was the almost of someone who doesn't do it often and doesn't quite complete it. "Understood." She went into the bay. What Pritchard told Colonel Marsh in 5 minutes was this. The Morrow building contained a storage unit, not the facility's official records, which had been transferred to the vendor, but a private unit registered under a shell company whose name was not Pine Valley Medical Center and not Garrison Lyle, but was, with a degree of documentation that would take a forensic accountant several hours to trace, connected to an LLC that had been set up by Paul Gersh 14 months before the billing irregularities began. In that unit were the original billing records, the unaltered ones, the ones that showed what had actually been billed versus what the services had actually been. Pritchard had been maintaining his own copies there because he had understood, approximately 18 months into his arrangement with Lyle and Gersh, that the direction the operation was moving put him in a position of personal legal exposure that was not going to be managed by the kind of verbal assurances Lyle was good at making. He had not gone to law enforcement because the personal legal exposure was real, and he had needed time to construct the terms of cooperation that would protect him sufficiently. He had been in conversation with an attorney about that process for the past 6 weeks. Tonight had not been planned. The cardiac event had not been planned. The parking garage had been a meeting with his attorney that had gone sideways when his heart had decided not to wait for the legal calendar. Colonel Marsh listened to all of it. She asked 2 questions, both precise, both concerning the documentation's specific location and the nature of access required. Pritchard answered both. She stood up. "I'm going to send someone to the Morrow building tonight," she said. Pritchard looked at the ceiling. "I know. Is there anything in that unit you don't want them to find?" A pause. "Yes." "Is it relevant to the patient safety cases?" "No." "Then we'll see how the night goes," she said, which was not a promise, but was the closest thing to one that the situation warranted. She walked out of the bay. The 30 minutes that followed moved with the specific compressed speed of institutional machinery shifting into a higher gear. The OIG investigators received their supervisor authorization at 7:49 p.m. and moved from the ambulance bay to the administrative corridor with the deliberate unhurry of people who are about to do something that will not be undone. They stopped at the second-floor conference room. They knocked. Lyle answered. Rachel did not see any of this. She was at the nursing station completing the last of her overdue charting, aware from the changed energy of the building, the way people moved differently, the conversations that stopped when she walked past. that things were happening above her that she was not yet being told about. She was not impatient about this. She had learned a long time ago that the moments when you can most effectively use patience are the moments when everything around you is moving fast. Tomas sat beside her. They worked in silence for 20 minutes. At 8:03 p.m., Lyle came down the stairs. He did not take the elevator, which Rachel noticed because the elevator would have been the faster option, and the fact that he chose the stairs suggested he had needed the additional 12 seconds. He came through the stairwell door with 2 OIG investigators behind him and Paul Gersh beside him. Gersh had been brought down from wherever he'd been waiting, and they walked through the administrative corridor toward the ER entrance. Lyle's jacket was still straight. His expression was the expression of a man who has made a calculation about the value of visible composure and is currently spending everything he has on it. He looked at Rachel as he passed the nursing station. She looked back at him. She did not say anything. There was nothing she needed to say. The situation had its own language now, and it was being spoken by people with federal authority and forensic documentation, and it did not require her contribution. Lyle looked away first. He walked past. At the ER entrance, where the automatic doors opened onto the Marlowe evening, a police vehicle was waiting. Not a Marine Corps vehicle. A city police vehicle, which meant the OIG investigators had coordinated with local law enforcement, and the coordination had been running parallel to everything else all evening, which meant this exit, Lyle and Gersh walking through those doors, had been the planned conclusion of a timeline that Rachel and Tomas and Colonel Marsh had been operating inside without the full map. Lyle stopped at the threshold. He turned, not toward Rachel, toward the ER in general. The department he had directed for 6 years, the bays and the station, and the corridor and the board that listed current patient status. He looked at it for approximately 3 seconds. Then he walked through the doors. Gersh followed without looking back at anything. The doors closed. The ER went on. Sandra Breck was still in the consultation room when her attorney told her, at 8:17 p.m., what the full scope of the investigation had become. He had spent the last 40 minutes on his phone in the corridor, calling people, receiving information, recalibrating the situation he'd walked into. He sat across from her and laid it out with the professional directness of someone who has decided that speed of information is the only thing still in his client's interest. He told her about the federal investigation. He told her about the billing fraud. He told her about the Morrow building, which the OIG was moving on tonight. He told her about Pritchard, who was cooperating and whose cooperation would include a detailed account of who had known what and when. Sandra sat with her hands in her lap and listened to all of it. When he finished, she said, "I didn't know about the billing." "I believe you," he said. "The question is whether the people asking you questions will, and the answer to that question depends significantly on what you tell them and when." Sandra looked at her hands. She thought about November. She thought about the meeting she'd had with Gersh after Rachel filed the complaint. The specific anodyne language of that conversation, the way Gersh had said this will be handled, and she had chosen not to ask what that meant. She had not asked what it meant because she had not wanted to know what it meant. Not knowing had felt like a form of protection. It had not been a form of protection. "What do I do?" she said. Her attorney opened his briefcase. "You talk to me first, for as long as it takes, and then we decide what you tell them and in what order." He pulled out a legal pad. "Start from the beginning. Not today. The beginning." Sandra looked at the motivational mountain, the sunrise, the sentence about teamwork. She started talking. At 9:11 p.m., 3 OIG investigators and 2 city police officers with a federal warrant entered the Morrow building. The storage unit was in the basement level. The access code had been provided by Pritchard from his hospital bed, where he was being monitored through the night. The unit was larger than a typical personal storage space. Industrial shelving, archival boxes, a small filing cabinet with a keyed lock that the investigators opened with a set from the warrant kit. The files inside were organized with the specific, meticulous care of someone who had been maintaining them as an exit option and had wanted them usable when the exit was needed. Billing records cross-referenced to altered incident reports. Original documentation alongside the Pine Valley system versions. A ledger, handwritten, which was its own commentary on Pritchard's assessment of digital security, that tracked disbursements from the shell company over 4 years. The investigators photographed everything before touching anything. At the top of the first archival box, separate from the billing records, in a manila envelope with no label, a second complaint. Not Rachel's November complaint, an earlier one. Filed 17 months ago by a nurse who no longer worked at Pine Valley. A nurse named Daria Wills who had left the department 13 months ago, following what her exit interview had characterized as professional disagreements with management and what the envelope's contents characterized as something considerably more specific. The complaint was 4 pages. It named Lyle, Gersh, and the shell company. Daria Wills had gotten that far through her own research before she'd been managed out of the building. She had filed her complaint with the hospital's external ethics line, which was administered by a contracted vendor, which meant it was supposed to be independent, which meant what happened to it was supposed to be impossible. It had been intercepted. Somehow, and the how would take investigators another 3 weeks to fully reconstruct. It had been flagged before it reached the ethics vendor's actual review team, and it had disappeared into a folder in a Morrow building box. And Daria Wills had received an automated confirmation email, and then nothing, and had waited, and had eventually concluded that she needed to leave the building and the city before something worse happened. Rachel did not know about Daria Wills yet. She would learn in the morning when Calloway from the State Medical Board came down to the ER with a copy of the envelope's contents and sat across from Rachel at a table in the family consultation room, the same room where Sandra Breck had spent the evening, and told her that she had not been the first to see it, and had not been alone in it, and that the person who had been alone in it longest had been a nurse she'd never met, who was currently living in Boise and working at a clinic, and had received a phone call tonight from an OIG investigator asking her to come in. But that was morning. Tonight, at 9:34 p.m., Rachel was at the nursing station finishing the last of her charting. The ER had returned to its ordinary rhythm. Not quiet, never quiet, but the manageable, steady rhythm of a department operating within its capacity. 3 bays occupied, 2 residents on, one of them managing a straightforward laceration, the other reviewing labs with the focused patience of someone who had turned the corner on their first real mass casualty shift. Tomas was packing his bag. His shift had ended 90 minutes ago, and he'd stayed without anyone asking him to. He zipped the bag and stood and looked at Rachel. "You going to be here all night?" "Until someone tells me I can't be." "Nobody's going to tell you that tonight." Rachel looked at her charts. "I know." He shouldered his bag. "Go home eventually." "I will." He walked out. Rachel sat alone at the nursing station for a moment in the specific quality of alone that follows a very long day. Not lonely, just solitary, the particular solitude of a person whose mind is still processing a series of events at the speed the events had demanded and is beginning, slowly, to downshift. She looked at the dog tags. Corporal James Aldrin. She had carried this name through 2 cities in 14 months and 1 very long afternoon in Marlow, Oregon, and she would carry it further. That was not in question. What James had meant when he said, "Keep them moving," they need to know someone's counting. She had not fully understood it when he'd said it, had spent 2 years thinking she did, and then realizing she didn't. And then this afternoon had arrived, and she thought she might be closer. Someone's counting meant the cases, the patients, the names of the people who came through a department and went out the other side, either better or worse for what happened inside it. Counting meant not looking away. Counting meant filing the complaint even when the complaint got buried. Counting meant staying on the sidewalk and watching the gurneys until someone with authority opened the door. She was not sure that was what he'd meant, but it was what she had made of it. The ER entrance doors opened. Lieutenant Ferraro came in, looked around, found her at the station. He crossed the floor and stopped in front of her and held out a document. "Signed by Colonel Marsh 20 minutes ago," he said. "Backdated to 1400 hours." Rachel took the document. It was a formal letter on Marine Corps' letterhead, a character and service verification, the kind issued when a commanding officer or senior officer is attesting to a former service member's record and character before a civilian institution. It named Rachel Hayes specifically. It cited her service record. It noted her medical commendations. It stated in language that was formal and precise and left no interpretive room that the identification tags belonging to Corporal James Aldrin had been entrusted to Lieutenant Rachel Hayes by CPL Aldrin himself, with witnesses, before his final mission. It requested, formally, that Pine Valley Medical Center recognize the service record and character of Rachel Hayes and restore her to her position without conditions. At the bottom, Colonel Marsh's signature. Rachel held the document. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she set it on the counter and went back to her charting, because there was one more patient whose notes needed to be completed before she could close the shift, and the notes mattered regardless of the letter, and regardless of the evening, and regardless of everything that had moved and shifted and broken open in the last 8 hours. She finished the notes at 9:52 p.m. She saved the chart. She sat back. The nursing station was quiet around her. The monitors beeped their steady rhythms. The night shift was running its ordinary business in the bays. Her phone buzzed. A number she didn't recognize, so not a local area code, not a number in her contacts. She looked at it for a moment, then answered. "Hayes," she said, a woman's voice. "Careful. My name is Daria Wills. An investigator gave me this number and said I should call tonight." A pause. "He said you'd know why." Rachel was very still. "I filed a complaint," Daria said. 17 months ago. I never heard back. I left the hospital. I assumed—" She stopped. "I assumed it had gone nowhere." "It went somewhere," Rachel said. "It just took a while." A long pause on the line. "Did anyone get hurt?" Daria said. "Between when I filed and now. Did patients get hurt because they buried it?" Rachel looked at the ER entrance, at the automatic doors in the dark parking lot beyond, where the Marine Corps vehicles were still there, still parked in their deliberate geometry, the last physical evidence of everything that had arrived today and changed the shape of this place. She thought about the 68-year-old woman with the wrong dosage of blood thinner. She thought about the medication error before that, the one she'd reported to Sandra and that Sandra had said was handled. She thought about $4.3 million and 3 years of altered records and what that meant in terms of patients who had passed through these doors and received care that was documented incorrectly. She thought about Donnie Ferris and surgical recovery, breathing steadily. "Yes," she said, "but we're going to make that part count." Daria was quiet. "The investigators are going to want to talk to you," Rachel said. "What you filed matters. What you know matters." "I have copies," Daria said. "I kept copies of everything. I didn't know if I'd ever—" Her voice stopped and started again. "I wasn't sure anyone was going to ask." Rachel's hand was tight on the phone. "Someone's asking," she said. On the second floor in the conference room where the JAG officer had first opened his notebook, the State Medical Board investigators were still working, cross-referencing documents, building the timeline, doing the patient, unglamorous work of turning a folder of evidence into a case that would hold. The OIG investigators would join them in the morning with the Morrow Building files, and the case would get larger and more specific and more consequential with each additional box. Lyle and Gersh were in 2 separate rooms at the Marlow Police Department, having invoked their attorneys within minutes of each other, and then sat in the specific silence of people who have run out of moves and are waiting to find out what the remaining moves cost. Sandra Breck was still in the consultation room, still talking to her attorney, the conversation now running 3 hours and showing no signs of reaching its natural end. Pritchard was in a monitored room on the cardiac floor, his rhythm stable, an OIG investigator seated outside his door, not to prevent escape, but to ensure that whatever happened next, he remained available to tell it. And in Boise, Daria Wills was sitting with her phone in her lap and copies of a 17-month-old complaint on the table in front of her, looking at them with the specific expression of someone who has been carrying something alone for a very long time and has just heard, for the first time, that the carrying was not for nothing. Rachel ended the call. She sat in the quiet nursing station. She put both hands flat on the counter and felt the surface under her palms. The cold, slightly worn laminate of a nursing station where she had worked for 14 months, where she had filed a complaint that had been buried, where she had been grabbed and accused and suspended and then walked back in and done the job anyway. She was still employed here. She did not know yet in what capacity or what would happen to the department's leadership structure in the days and weeks following tonight. That was not her decision, and she was not trying to make it one. What she knew was that the cases were documented. The patients were counted. The names were in the record. That was what she had. Tomorrow she would sit across from investigators and tell everything she knew in the order she knew it, and they would write it down, and it would become part of the formal account of what had happened here and what it had cost. But the thing that was not yet settled, the thing that was still moving, still not complete, was not about Lyle or Gersh or the fraud case or the state medical board. It was smaller and closer than all of that, and it had been sitting in the back of her mind since 9:11 p.m. when the Morrow building had been opened and the files had been found and the investigators had started photographing. Daria Wills had filed 17 months ago. Tomas had been keeping copies for 2 years. Rachel had filed 8 months ago. 3 nurses, 3 complaints, 3 separate attempts to make the same true thing visible, and each of them had been managed differently. One buried entirely, one moved to rotating shifts, one met with a public accusation designed to strip away her credibility before anyone could hear what she had to say. 3 nurses. And the system had almost worked. It had almost held. It had taken a highway accident and a Marine Corps convoy and a man with a failing heart in a parking garage to expose the seam. If the bus had not crashed, if the convoy had not been rerouted, if Pritchard's heart had held one more day. 3 nurses had been doing the right thing, and the institution had been absorbing it without consequence for 2 years. That was the thing that Rachel sat with in the quiet station at 10:07 p.m. Not the victory of tonight, which was real, but the 2 years before tonight, which were also real, and which would need to be accounted for with more than a criminal indictment and a medical board sanction. She picked up her pen. She pulled out a fresh sheet of paper, not a chart, not a form, just a blank page from the printer tray. And at the top, she wrote 3 names. Her own, Tomas Reyes, Daria Wills's. Below that, she started writing the dates, the specific sequence of events and complaints and responses that had constituted the institutional timeline. She was not doing this for the investigators, who had their own documentation now. She was doing it because she needed to see it whole, all of it in order, the full picture of what had been happening in this building before she arrived and what had continued while she was here. She was halfway through the second name when she noticed something. A gap. Between Daria Will's departure from Pine Valley 13 months ago and Tomas Reyes' first documented copy, the earliest copy in the package he had assembled, there were 4 months. 4 months during which neither Tomas, nor Daria, nor Rachel had been actively documenting. 4 months between the suppression of one complaint and the beginning of the next effort. She had not thought about those 4 months before now. She looked at the gap on the page. 4 months in an active fraud operation was not nothing. 4 months was enough to generate additional billing submissions, enough to alter additional incident reports, enough to manage additional incidents in ways that were now part of the record. She was about to set it aside. It was late. It could wait. The investigators would find it. When her phone buzzed again. Calloway, from the State Medical Board. Not a call. A text. We're looking at a patient from month 16 of the review period. Deceased. Discharge documentation conflicts with original admission chart. Can you come up? Month 16 of the review period was 18 months ago. 1 month after Daria Wills had filed her complaint, and 4 months before Tomas had started keeping copies. The gap. Rachel pushed back from the nursing station. She was moving toward the stairs before she had finished the thought. The blank page with 3 names still on the counter behind her, the pen still uncapped beside it, the ER running its ordinary rhythms around the space she'd just vacated. The elevator would have been faster. She took the stairs. The patient's name was Harold Greer, 71 years old. Admitted 18 months ago with acute respiratory distress and discharged 11 days later with documentation that listed his condition as resolved and his treatment as standard. He had died at home 6 weeks after discharge. His death certificate listed natural causes, cardiac failure secondary to chronic lung disease. Calloway had the original admission chart on the table when Rachel walked in. The discharge documentation said his oxygen saturation at discharge had been 94%. The original admission chart, the one from the Morrow building, the one that had not been in Pine Valley's system, showed his saturation on the day of discharge had been 88%. 6 points. The difference between a patient who could be sent home and a patient who needed another 72 hours of monitoring minimum. 6 points that someone had changed in the documentation after the fact. Rachel stood at the table and looked at both pages side by side. "Who signed the discharge?" she said. Calloway pointed to the signature on the discharge form. A physician's signature, looping and fast the way physician signatures are. Below it, a countersigning nurse. The nurse's name was not Rachel. It was not Tomas. It was not Dario Wills. It was a nurse who had left Pine Valley 8 months ago, 2 weeks before Rachel had filed her November complaint, and whose exit interview, which Calloway had pulled in the last 20 minutes, listed the reason for departure as pursuing other opportunities. "We need to find her," Rachel said. "We're working on it." Calloway looked at the 2 pages. "The question tonight is the physician." Rachel looked at the discharge signature again. She did not recognize the name, but she recognized what it meant. A physician who had signed a discharge on a patient with an 88% saturation and had allowed the documentation to be changed afterward, or had changed it themselves to cover the decision. A patient who had gone home and had not come back to the hospital but had not gotten better, had instead gotten worse in the quiet, private way that happens when someone is discharged 6 points too low and nobody follows up properly. Harold Greer had died at home. His family did not know yet that his discharge documentation was wrong. His family did not know yet that the number that had determined when he went home had been a number that someone had invented. Rachel sat down across from Calloway. "What do you need from me?" she said. "Right now, nothing you haven't already given us. But in the morning—" "I'll be here," Rachel said. "Whatever time you need." Calloway looked at her for a moment. Not the professional assessment look she'd had when she'd arrived. Something different, more direct. "You've been here since morning." "I know. Is there someone who should come get you?" Rachel looked at the table. It was a human question, the kind that cut through the procedural language of the evening and arrived at the actual person inside it. She was not used to those questions from people she'd met 3 hours ago, and she was not entirely sure what to do with it. "I'm okay," she said. "That's not what I asked." Rachel was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "There isn't really someone who comes and gets me." Calloway nodded. She didn't push it, which was the right instinct. "Go home and sleep. Be back at 8. Rachel stood. She looked at Harold Greer's 2 charts on the table, the real one and the false one, side by side. One man's health reduced to 2 contradictory numbers on 2 pieces of paper. "His family," she said. "Who tells them?" "That's a process," Calloway said. "It doesn't happen tonight, but it happens." Rachel nodded. She walked out. The drive home took 22 minutes. She didn't turn on the radio. The Marlow streets were mostly empty. It was past 10, past the hour when even the busier parts of the city ran down to a handful of lit windows and the occasional late-night errand. She drove with both hands on the wheel, and her mind doing the thing it did on the drive home after hard shifts, which was replay. Not obsessively, not in a spiral, just the systematic walkthrough of what had happened and what it meant and what came next. Harold Greer's name was going to be the center of what came next. The billing fraud and the altered incident reports were institutional crimes, the kind that resulted in federal charges and license suspensions and civil penalties. But Harold Greer was a man who had gone home when he should have stayed and had died when he might not have, and that was a different category. That was the kind of thing that needed to be answered for in a way that could not be answered by a financial penalty. She parked in front of her building and sat in the truck for a while. She thought about James Aldrin. Not the grief of it. She had done that grief over a long time in private, had arrived at something that was not peace exactly, but was the functional version of it that lets you carry a name without being crushed by it. She thought about what he'd said, the specific words. Keep them moving. They need to know someone's counting. She understood it better now than she had at any point in the 2 years since. The counting was not comfortable. The counting was not rewarded, necessarily, not quickly, not in any form you could hold. The counting meant sitting in a conference room at 10 p.m. looking at 2 versions of an old man's oxygen saturation. It meant filing a complaint that got buried. It meant coming back to a building that had suspended you because the building needed you, and the patients inside it needed you, and the counting required your presence even when the institution did not. It was not heroic, it was just necessary. Those were different things, and the difference mattered. She went inside. But the weeks that followed were not cinematic. They were procedural and slow and full of the administrative language of institutional accountability, which is thorough and specific and almost completely lacking in dramatic satisfaction. Garrison Lyle was charged federally on 4 counts of healthcare fraud and 1 count of obstruction. He was suspended from medical practice pending trial within 72 hours of his arrest by order of the Oregon Medical Board. The suspension was public record. Paul Gersh was charged on 6 counts. The billing fraud ran deeper in his direction, and the shell company was traced entirely to his formation. His cooperation, when it came late enough that it bought him limited consideration. His name was on the obstruction filing separately, for the burial of Daria Will's complaint. That charge carried its own weight. The physician who had signed Harold Greer's discharge, a Dr. Philip Maurer, who had left Pine Valley 11 months ago and was currently practicing at a clinic in Portland, was reached by OIG investigators on day 3 of the formal investigation. He did not deny the signature. He said he had been told the documentation had been corrected by administrative staff and that he had not reviewed the correction. The investigation determined that this was partially true and substantially incomplete, and his license was referred for review. Sandra Breck was not charged criminally. Her attorney had done the work that attorneys do when the work is available to be done. And Sandra's cooperation, 3 hours in the consultation room and then many more in the days following, covering everything she'd known and when she'd known it, had been thorough enough and early enough to constitute meaningful assistance to the investigation. She received a formal reprimand from the state nursing board and a 2-year probationary period. She resigned from Pine Valley before the reprimand was finalized. She sent Rachel a text 3 weeks after the evening. 3 words. "I'm sorry, Hayes." Rachel read it twice and did not respond because there was no response that was both true and useful, and she was not in the business of responses that were neither. Daria Wills flew in from Boise on day 5. She sat across from Rachel in the family consultation room, the same room which had become a kind of unofficial headquarters for every difficult conversation that week. And they talked for 2 hours about what they had each seen and documented and reported, and what had happened to those reports. They were very different people. Daria was louder than Rachel, more expressive, given to longer sentences and sharper reactions. She cried once, briefly, when she described the automated confirmation email she'd received after her complaint, the one that had said, "Your report has been received and will be reviewed," and after which she had heard nothing. She had waited for 40 days. She had sent 2 follow-up emails. Both had been logged as received. Neither had generated a response. "I thought I'd done it wrong," Daria said. "I thought I'd somehow filed it in the wrong place or said it wrong or—" She stopped. "I kept trying to figure out what I should have done differently." Rachel was quiet for a moment. "You did it right. They just made sure it went nowhere." "I know that now." Daria looked at the table. "It took me a long time to know it." Rachel understood that. She understood the specific private erosion of filing a complaint and watching it disappear, the way it turned inward if you weren't careful. The questioning of your own perception, your own memory, your own sense of what you'd seen, and whether it was as serious as you'd thought. Systems that bury complaints know what they're doing to the people who file them. The burial is not accidental. The silence is a message. "It was serious," Rachel said. "Everything you filed was serious. You were right." Daria looked at her. "I know that doesn't fix the 40 days, Rachel said. "But you were right." Daria nodded. She looked at the table for a long moment, and when she looked up, her face had settled into something more solid than it had been when she'd arrived. The formal Marine Corps ceremony was held on a Thursday morning, 31 days after the highway accident. It was outside Pine Valley Medical Center, not by accident. The location had been Colonel Marsh's choice, and when Rachel had asked her why not somewhere else, somewhere without the specific associations this parking lot now carried, the colonel had said, "Because this is where it happened, and what happened here shouldn't be moved somewhere it can be forgotten." The ceremony was smaller than a formal military event and larger than a private recognition. Colonel Marsh, Lieutenant Ferraro, a dozen Marines, including PFC Donnie Ferris, who had been out of surgery for 3 weeks and stood in his uniform with a posture that still cost him something around the midsection, but which he maintained without showing. Members of the hospital's incoming interim leadership, the State Medical Board's regional director, Callaway, the OIG investigators who had worked the case, Tomas Rea, in civilian clothes, standing near the back with his arms crossed and his face doing nothing in particular. Daria Wills had driven down from Boise. She stood beside Tomas, and they had not met before that morning, and spent the first 10 minutes in the specific, careful small talk of two people who know they share something significant and are working out how to be around each other. Rachel stood at the front of it in her hospital scrubs, which was a deliberate choice. She had been asked if she wanted to wear something more formal. She had said no. She was a nurse. The scrubs were the formal attire. Colonel Marsh presented the Distinguished Civilian Service Medal with the efficient, unsentimental brevity of a military ceremony. Not cold, but compressed. The citation named her service years, her combat nursing record, her role in the bus accident response, and her actions in identifying and reporting patient safety violations at Pine Valley Medical Center. It did not say in spite of institutional opposition or against considerable pressure, because those things did not need to be said in the citation to be understood by everyone in the parking lot. Rachel accepted the medal with both hands. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at the colonel. "Aldrin should have one of these," she said, quietly, just between them. "He has one," the colonel said. "Posthumous. His family received it 14 months ago." A pause. "I thought you should know." Rachel closed her hands around the medal. The interim hospital director, a woman brought in from outside Oregon to stabilize the department while the board determined permanent leadership, announced at the ceremony's close that Rachel Hayes was being appointed Director of Emergency Trauma Education at Pine Valley Medical Center, effective immediately, with full reinstatement of her prior position concurrent with that appointment. There was applause. It was genuine, not polite. Donnie Ferris started it. Rachel looked at the assembled faces. She was not comfortable with applause and had known this moment was coming and had not found a way to become comfortable with it in the intervening 31 days. She stood in it with her hands at her sides and the medal in her left fist and her face doing the neutral thing it did when she was managing more than she was showing. Then Tomas caught her eye from the back. He uncrossed his arms. He started clapping. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing. She looked away before her face did something she'd have to manage. She kept the medal in the glove compartment of her truck for 2 weeks before she brought it inside. It wasn't avoidance, or not entirely. It was more that she needed it out of sight while she sorted out what it meant and what she was going to do with it. What she was going to do with it turned out to be this: mount it on the wall of the small office she'd been given as Director of Trauma Education, beside a printed copy of Pine Valley's new mandatory incident reporting protocol, the one she'd spent 3 weeks helping draft with the interim director and the medical board, the one that bypassed every internal administrative layer and went directly to an independent external reviewer, the one that included specific provisions protecting nurses who filed complaints from reassignment, rotation changes, or any form of professional consequence. The protocol was named the Greer-Wills Standard, after Harold Greer and Daria Wills. Rachel had proposed both names. The board had accepted both without discussion. She was not a perfect person. She was not a hero in the frictionless sense. She had stayed quiet when she should have spoken twice, had not filed formally the first time, had spent 8 months after the buried complaint watching and waiting instead of escalating through every available channel simultaneously. She had been afraid in ways she had not fully admitted to herself at the time. That was true, and she held it as true. But she had filed. She had stayed in the building when they'd tried to push her out. She had caught a 23-year-old's dropping pressure in time. She had answered Daria Wills' call at 10 p.m. on the hardest day she'd had in years, and had told her that what she'd filed had mattered, because it had. The dog tags stayed around her neck. They would stay there, not as weight. She had stopped carrying them as weight some time ago, though she couldn't name the exact moment. They were there as a record, as an account, as the specific physical reminder that someone had put them in her hands with intention and that the intention was ongoing, and that the counting was not finished. Here is what Rachel Hayes understood that she had not understood clearly at the beginning of all of this. Institutions protect themselves. That is their nature, not their corruption. The corruption is when self-protection becomes the primary function, when the system starts generating paperwork to cover the gaps in its own care instead of filling them. She had walked into Pine Valley Medical Center 14 months ago with a service record and a pair of dog tags and a particular kind of competence, and the institution had looked at her and seen a variable it could not control, and it had done what unaccountable institutions do with variables it cannot control. It had not worked. Not because she was exceptional, though she was competent, and competence had mattered. Not because the Marines had arrived at the right moment, though the timing had been real and the convoy had changed what was possible. It had not worked because 3 nurses had been counting separately for 2 years in a building that had banked on the counting being invisible. The institution had calculated that no one was watching closely enough for long enough. Tomas had been watching for 2 years. Daria had watched before that. Rachel had filed when the counting produced something she could not let go unrecorded. 3 people. 3 separate acts of ordinary professional courage in a building that had tried very hard to make that courage feel pointless. It had not been pointless. That was the thing worth holding on to. Not the medal, not the ceremony, not even the new protocol on the wall. The thing worth holding on to was this. The counting mattered before anyone saw it. It mattered when the complaint was buried. It mattered when Daria left Boise without knowing what had happened to her 4 pages. It mattered when Tomas copied documents in a quiet office at the end of a shift and put them in a folder and hoped. The work you do when no one is watching is not less real because no one is watching. The record you keep when the institution has decided not to keep it is not less true because it lives in a folder in a private space. What is true stays true. What is documented eventually surfaces. What is counted eventually counts. Rachel had learned this not from a ceremony or a medal or a colonel's formal recognition. She had learned it from a Marine corporal who had pressed 2 pieces of metal into her hands before a mission he didn't come back from and told her to keep something moving that he believed was worth keeping. She had kept it moving. She walked into the ER at the start of her first official shift as both trauma nurse and director of trauma education, and she put on her gloves and she went to work. That was the whole of it. That was enough.